3D gaming took the world by storm in late 1994 with the release of the original PlayStation, and it wasn't long before Nintendo came out with their own competitor, the Nintendo 64. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and few consoles are remembered even half as fondly as the Nintendo 64. So today we're going to be taking a closer look at the console and how it holds up in 2019. Before we get into this, make sure you go follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech so you can keep up with my boring life. I suppose I probably should have made that sound more appealing, but without further ado, let's talk about the N64. The Nintendo 64 was released in Japan in the June of 1996, and then in North America the following September. It was a technically impressive 64-bit machine, hence the name Nintendo 64, and was able to play completely 3D games. Dozens of classics came during this time, and even if you haven't played this console, it's hard to deny the influence it had on the gaming market over the years. But it is over 20 years old already, and so it's kind of interesting to look back at the hardware as is. The case of the console is fairly simple, being a black plastic shell. There actually were a lot of different colors of the N64, but this one was by and far the most common. The logo on the front is iconic, and I like the way it's presented with the glossy little emblem, you could say. Below it are 4 controller ports in gray, and on the top of the console we see the cartridge slot. We also have a spot for a memory card, a reset button, and a slider for the power. I kind of like the power slider. It's not something you see a whole lot anymore, so I found that kind of unique. The back of the console is surprisingly interesting. We have the normal port for video out, which is fine, but beside it we actually have a slot for the power supply. You actually have to slide the power supply into the console itself, and then of course the power supply is attached to a cord to plug it into the wall. I really like this. Even up to recent consoles, many would use power supplies outside of the actual console, so you would have the big power brick, which was annoying and would clutter up all the cords behind the TV. Having a power supply built in is very intuitive, and as simple as it is, it's a nice touch. The bottom of the console actually has an expansion port, but it really isn't compatible with anything outside of Japan. In Japan, a CD add-on was sold, and there might have been a few more accessories, but around here it is completely useless. Holding the console itself is pretty crazy. It's very light, and it's also smaller than it looks. I really like how compact this thing is, and I kind of wish consoles today were this small. It's pretty nice. You might think the N64 looks pretty normal for a video game console, but you'll probably have a different opinion of the controller. It's quite frankly a monstrosity by today's standards, with 3 very unergonomic handles and a D-pad on the left, joystick in the middle, and normal buttons on the right. It also has a couple triggers on the shoulders, and then another trigger on the middle handle. There's a fine line between really smart and really crappy design, and this controller almost makes it into the positive. I can definitely see what Nintendo was going for with this controller. The 3 handles actually give you some options. For games with more classic, typical controls, usually 2D games, you would grab the far handles on both sides and use the D-pad to move around, just like you would have on the NES or SNES. And then for newer 3D games that required, well, more 3-dimensional movement, you would grasp the middle handle and use the joystick. This controller, I think, was meant to have the best of both worlds for all players, and that by itself isn't a horrible idea. The problem is that it wasn't terribly well executed, and as a result this controller has aged horribly. It's uncomfortable to play with and looks ridiculous. But still, mad props to Nintendo for trying something different, and it all worked out in the end, with this being the stepping stone for what is typically considered one of the best ways to game of all time, the GameCube controller. And the controller in a way was better than the original PlayStation controller, as that one had no joysticks at all. Overall, the controller could have been better, but hey, it could have also been a lot worse. And how you play games is important, but I don't think it's quite as important as the games themselves. And oh boy, does the Nintendo 64 ever have some classics. First and foremost, you have the game that essentially made the console, Super Mario 64. To make the jump from 2D to 3D was no simple task, but Nintendo absolutely nailed it here, and Super Mario 64 has been an undisputed, overwhelmingly top-rated game ever since its launch. It might look old by today's standards, and that's because it is, games, but keep in mind this was Mario's first foray into the 3D space. While some other companies struggled with this, Nintendo was able to make a game with good controls, great graphics for the time, and best of all, fun gameplay. This was the game for the Nintendo 64, and it set the standard for 3D Mario games in the future. I would say the only games that have come close to capturing the magic of this game would be Super Mario Sunshine and the recent Super Mario Odyssey. Both games are kind of similar, especially the latter one, and if you haven't played them yet, you absolutely should. Note, for those of you unhappy I didn't include Super Mario Galaxy in that sentiment, keep in mind that it's a great game but completely different in how it plays from Super Mario 64. It's kind of its own thing. But Super Mario 64 wasn't the only game to be released with the Nintendo 64. We have lots of other classics to speak of. If you're unimpressed with me saying Super Mario 64 was the best N64 game of all time, it was probably for a decent reason, because Zelda Ocarina of Time was a thing. Now, as someone who has never played the game, I'll admit that I'm a bit biased and don't have much to say on it, but I completely understand where you're coming from if you prefer it over Mario. It was an absolute marvel back in the 90s and holds up well even to this day. There's lots of exploration and it's really hard to argue with, and the fun doesn't stop there. The N64 also gave us Mario Kart 64, Goldeneye 007, Star Fox 64, Banjo-Kazooie, multiple Mario parties, Donkey Kong 64, Paper Mario, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Zelda Majora's Mask, Super Smash Bros., and probably another few dozen games ending in 64. I realized they were excited for 64 bits, but was it necessary to add it at the end of almost every single Nintendo game? I mean, I'm not complaining, but I do find it a bit funny. Anyway, there are dozens of titles for you to sink your teeth into if you somehow still have the N64, although finding games can be a bit of a pain. They often go for a surprisingly expensive price on places like eBay, especially if you want one with the original box and manual. Super Mario 64 cost me about 35 bucks, which is, funnily enough, the same as what I paid for the console itself, but I'll talk about pricing a little later here. While the Nintendo 64 had a lot of classics, it didn't sell nearly as well as Nintendo's past consoles, with the big reason being the PS1 drawing away the sales. Despite being released 2 years earlier, the PlayStation was much more technically advanced thanks to using optical discs over cartridges. An N64 cartridge could hold around 64 megabytes, and a PlayStation disc could hold around 650 megabytes. Needless to say, the PlayStation 1 was much more impressive, and games like Final Fantasy VII wouldn't have been nearly as feasible with the N64. That being said, despite having almost triple the amount of games as the N64, most would argue that the N64 had more classics, and I don't think I disagree. It really depends on your tastes, and more than anything, I think it depends on which console you grew up with as a kid. PS1 or N64, both are great pieces of gaming history, and it's easy just to jump in and have a fun time with pretty much any game on these consoles. One advantage the N64 had was 4-player split screen, which was awesome. Games like Goldeneye 007 weren't really a thing for the PlayStation 1, and so if you wanted a couch co-op multiplayer experience, the N64 was definitely the way to go. There were multiplayer games on the PS1 as well, but you had to buy a separate accessory to connect 4 controllers, which was a pain. You also had Super Smash Bros. On the N64, which, I mean, it's safe to say, that franchise turned out to be a big success. That kind of game was only on the N64 back in the day. You couldn't get that same experience with any other console. In 2019, the N64 has held up surprisingly well. The graphics certainly haven't aged great at all, but there's a certain charm to the few polygons it has, and it's impressive what they did in the 90s considering the limited hardware. If you're interested in playing the N64, you'll actually have to pick up an older console. While the NES and SNES both got mini consoles, it doesn't seem like an N64 version is on the horizon anytime soon. It's feasible and could happen, but I wouldn't expect it, especially since Nintendo basically said they weren't doing it last year. Besides an emulator, you can pick up an actual N64 for pretty cheap on eBay, Craigslist, or even maybe your local thrift store. I got this one for 35 bucks Canadian at a secondhand store, and it came with both a controller and the cords. Funnily enough, many games are actually more expensive than the console itself, as mentioned earlier, as a lot of them didn't sell in massive quantities and have become relatively rare. A good example of this is Conker's Bad Fur Day, a cult classic that'll cost you upwards of $100, possibly even more if you want the original box and manual. Of course, you could always buy a Chinese knockoff for around 20 bucks on eBay, but what's the fun in that? Speaking of which, if you're buying a game and want the original copy, try to ensure you're not getting ripped off, as eBay, Craigslist, or wherever typically have a lot of knockoffs floating around, sometimes under the pretense of being an original copy, so maybe do some research to discern the differences before actually buying one. Or don't bother and just download an emulator. It's definitely a lot cheaper. They're everywhere online, and you can actually get much better performance and higher quality graphics out of the N64 if you use an emulator. Overall, the Nintendo 64 was really interesting for me to look at. I was born in the year 2000, so it was actually before my time, although I do remember playing the PS1 when I was really young and eventually moving to the PS2. I never had a Nintendo console when I was a kid, so going back and playing these older games is kind of neat. I don't have the rose-tinted glasses most people do when it comes to these old games, and yet playing Super Mario 64 is still a lot of fun, and the gameplay has held up really well. I've played Super Mario Odyssey on the Switch, and it's pretty obvious where most of its inspiration came from. But enough from me, I'd like to hear from all of you. What are your experiences with the Nintendo 64? Did you ever have one? What were your favorite games? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this video interesting, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech if you would like. And with that all being said, I'm Josh from 91tech, and I will see you all next time.